Live streaming is on.
Okay, guys, welcome to Social Studies today. So I posted yesterday this lesson with the video. Hopefully got a chance to watch the video, and kind of talks about what historical thinking is, how we look at history is really what this lesson is going to be about. And, history, I think a lot of times we think history of things that happened in the past, which it is, but there's also current history going on, especially this year. There's been so much going on. So if you look at this first question, it says activity 1, who writes history? So the first part says what happened in this past year. Write a 1-paragraph history of the most important events that happened in the past year. And boy, you guys could write about a variety of things. Obviously, the pandemic would be a great thing to write about. The social injustice is happening, the protests, anything that you really think is important to you, you could certainly write about. But those two things, to me, seem like the most logical. So for number 1, you would just, and if we were in class, I'd give you guys a couple minutes to write this. And then, we would just go around the room and talk about what people wrote. And I'm just assuming, and I don't know, that most of us would have probably written about the pandemic or about the protests about police brutality or the social injustice that's going on in our country. And that's going to ask, were anyone's events the same, and why not? Well, some people maybe have a different perspective. So maybe some people didn't write about the pandemic or, the social injustice. Maybe someone wrote about the stock market. I guess a lot of history is really what's near and dear or important to you. But for the most part, I would think the pandemic has really affected everyone. And, if you've been watching the news, the protests of social injustice are on the news all the time. So I'm just basically thinking those would be the biggest 2 topics that people would have wrote about. Okay, then it goes on to question 3. If you were going to use these paragraphs to write a history book over the past year for our kids to read about in school, whose paragraph should we include? Why? Would this paragraph be leaving anything out? Then what we would just talk about is, basically if we're going to talk about the pandemic, we would talk about kind of the details of it. We would talk about, if we're talking about the social injustice, we talk about that. And the key details, we want to make sure that we're kind of getting a consensus that everyone's point of view is kind of into those paragraphs. Because remember, we're writing them for kids in schools. We want to make sure we're not leaving anything out. And as you guys probably realize, sometimes when they write history textbooks, things are left out. Maybe it's just a couple people's perspective. I think they surely probably don't get a group of people together, or if they do, they might not be diverse. They might be all, one socioeconomic class. They might be all one color. They might be all, from the same area of the country. And what happens is you really don't get a whole picture because it's kind of slanted towards what those people think is history. So by us sharing our paragraphs, we would be getting everyone's perspective in class. And we'd be making sure that, one person's view on the pandemic might be a little bit different from another person's view. And the same thing with, obviously, the social injustice, the protests. Some people's views might be a little bit different. So we want to make sure that we kind of talk about that. So when we do write that paragraph for the kids, we kind of get the full picture. Okay. And that's really what this activity would be about if we were doing this in class. Okay. I'm going to go on to number 4. And it says, knowing what you do about how difficult it was to agree on the most important events from just this last weekend, how do you think historians decide on what to include in history textbooks? And do you believe these inclusions are always accurate? Why or why not? Well, we just talked about why sometimes they're not why they're inaccurate. because they don't get everyone's perspective. Okay. And that's why sometimes, there's gaps in textbooks. They're slanted. They don't really give you the full picture. Okay. That's why sometimes, when you're reading out of a textbook, you have to be careful because it doesn't give you the full picture. And even you guys, your perspective on maybe the pandemic from two different people's point of views, it could be a little bit different. You're talking about the same thing. And also with the protests, someone could be pro-police and someone else could be pro-protesters. So you kind of get two different perspectives on what's going on. And sometimes only one perspective is written in the history books. That's why I said sometimes you have to be careful and sometimes you have to read a little bit different. And then 5, whose voices or experience might sometimes be left out of the history books. Well, in our country, a lot of times it's lower socioeconomic people, minorities, immigrants, maybe. For the most part, I would say the textbooks are written from people who are in the establishment. I mean, that's people that have power, have money, and their perspective is very different from people of lower socioeconomics, immigrants, people of color. So sometimes their voices aren't really heard. And that's really, some of you probably haven't been in, school in a while, but your history books were really, it's from one perspective. A lot of times you don't get the entire perspective. That's why this activity in class, we would have gotten everyone's perspective and put it into one paragraph. Okay. Number 6 here. So it says what we know about Christopher Columbus. What do you know or have learned about Christopher Columbus? If you were born here, did you learn about it in school? What did your teachers tell you? Okay. So some of you that weren't born here, you're probably not going to know very much about Christopher Columbus. Other than maybe, there's a holiday named after him in October and it's a day off from school. That might be the most you know about him. But if you're born here, probably in elementary school, you learned about Christopher Columbus. And a lot of it really wasn't very accurate. A lot of people think he discovered America, which he didn't. But you basically were taught that all throughout, elementary school. And that's pretty much what you were, you didn't really question your teachers when you're in elementary school. You didn't know any better. But as, maybe you got older and you got a bigger picture of who Christopher Columbus was. Okay. So you're basically based off what your teachers told you or what the history textbooks told you. Okay. And that's not always accurate. So below are 2 excerpts from books about Christopher Columbus. So you're going to read through them both. There's excerpt 1 and excerpt 2. So go ahead and take a couple minutes to read through those. Okay, so what you probably realized is these two excerpts are completely different. One paints, the first one paints Christopher Columbus in really a bad light, and the second one not so much. So you can see probably in a lot of textbooks, the first expert probably wasn't in there. It was the second one. You know, everyone wants to hail him as discovering, you know, North America and even the United States. So, and you can see how just two different perspectives of history, you get two different really ideas of who Christopher Columbus was. So what it asks you to do here is you kind of compare and contrast. And how you would do that is, let me bring up my whiteboard here. Let me get rid of this. So what a T-chart is, just here. So on this side, you would put Article 1 on one side. And on their side, you'd put Article 2. So over here, you put, the first one paints them in kind of a negative light. So you put some of the details from the first article over here. And then the second one paints them in a better light. You put some of the details over here. And it's really up to you what you want to put in each side of that T-chart. But what you're able to do, well, a T-chart's important. Then you can kind of compare, because you can look on what's on the left side in Article 1, then look on the right side from Article 2, and you can kind of compare the two right side by side. Okay. Okay. So it asks number 2, in what ways the information and the entries can contradict with each other? Why do you think they contain different information? Well, obviously it's from two different people's perspectives. You know, one wanted to paint Christopher Columbus in a positive light, and the other one talked about some of the terrible things that he did, you know, about like the slave trade, you know, about stealing, you know, cutting people's ears off, intimidation. And the second one really doesn't touch on any of that. It really wants to paint him as a positive person. Okay, number 3 said, if you're going to include information from each side for a history textbook for students, what information would you include? What would you leave out? Is there anything you would like to know more about? So for that, I think, you know, I think you have to include the good with the bad. You know, you can't really whitewash history and just include the good, because there was a lot of bad things that he did. Sure, he did come from Europe to basically, you know, Cuba. But once he got there, you know, he did a lot of negative things. So I think you really have to include both. And then, is there anything else you would like to know about? You know, maybe why, you know, why wasn't he punished for some of the stuff he did? Or was it okay with the Queen of Spain? Did they know what he was doing? I guess is one question you might want to ask. Were they okay with that? So you might need a little more information. You know, did the Native Americans or the natives try to fight back? Things like that, you know, are, I think, important questions that you might want to ask. Let me see here. Okay, this is just contrasts and contradictions. And it talks about definition. The character acts in a way that is contradictory or unexpected given how she usually acts. The author shows feelings or actions the reader hasn't seen before, doesn't expect. And why would the character act this way? You know, I guess Columbus, you would probably say, was pretty greedy is why he acted that way. He wanted to be rich. And, when he came to North America, especially Cuba, there were a lot of things there that they didn't have in, Spain. So, it says in the second one, he always wanted to become rich. So he thought like stealing gold was a way that he could get rich. But, the contradiction is a lot of us never really learned that about Christopher Columbus. All our textbooks probably kind of wash over that first part. And a lot of your teachers don't really talk about that. Okay. And even, unless you, went to college and took a history class about Christopher Columbus or read a lot of books, you wouldn't know all that. So sometimes, a lot of that stuff just isn't known about him unless you really dig deeper about it. So that's really a contradiction is, you didn't really learn about that. And to a lot of you, maybe didn't know that about Christopher Columbus till today. Okay. And that's an aha moment. That's when you realize, wow, Christopher Columbus wasn't the person I thought he was. And it's like the aha, something goes off in your brain where you're like, wow, I never knew that about him. And that's what they call an aha moment. Okay. And tough questions, characteristic tough question that reveals his or her concerns or inner conflict. And that would be, wow, I really thought that Christopher Columbus, was this, wonderful explorer. He did good things. He helped discover America, but when you ask a tough question, it's like, what were the negative things about him? And that's really, was explained in kind of that first article you read. So sometimes, you have to ask the tough questions, especially with people in history. A lot of that's going on now with the Confederate generals. Even, it's not a secret that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. They went on to become president. And, a lot of times people don't talk about some of the, negative things. And with all our presidents, a lot of the history books try to paint them in a positive light. And, every person has some flaws, but a lot of times those flaws aren't exposed. And those are the tough questions you need to ask when we're looking at history. Okay. And words of the wiser. That's an older character, mentor, advisor, parent gives advice or an insight to the main character. So that might be for Christopher Columbus. It might be like what we're doing right now. Someone tells you something you didn't know about him. And that could be about, it's like we basically, when you study about, your kids study about maybe in 15 or 20 years about Barack Obama or Donald Trump, you lived during their presidency. So you could be the words of the wise. You could talk about some of the things that weren't covered in the textbook, both good and bad. Okay. It doesn't always have to be bad. It can be good things that people don't remember. Okay. And again, that's when the author keeps bringing up the same image, phrase, or inference. And that would be kind of, if we use Christopher Columbus, time after time, only the good things are brought up, or even always the bad things are brought up. And I guess with every person, there's got to be a little bit good and a little bit bad. It can't always be, one-sided. There could be more bad things or more good things, but there's probably a little bit of both. Obviously no one's perfect. And, so I think it's important to realize that there's, kind of two sides to the coin. Okay. And memory moment, that could be something you remember when they're talking about someone that hasn't been brought up. And it might be important to the discussion, especially with presidents, historical figures, mayors, things like that, athletes, singers. It's something that you haven't really talked about, and you think about them, and something pops into your mind. And that's just a memory moment. Okay. So if we were going to do this in class, this is just the activity. So if we're going to break you up, there'd be a leader of the group who makes sure everyone's voice is heard. That person would just call on everyone. So if we're using the pandemic, for example, and we had 5 or 6 people in the class. One person would just make sure that he or she calls on every person to make sure that everyone's voice is heard. You have a recorder who is basically taking down all the information, making sure it's accurately recorded. Okay, you want to get exactly what people are saying. You'd have a timekeeper, say everyone gets 5 minutes to kind of share their story. And when that 5 minutes is up, they go on the next person just to make sure everyone gets equal amount of time. And then someone would look at all the stuff that was written down or recorded and present it back to the class. Okay. And that pretty much is it for today's history lesson. So, the biggest thing is just you have to remember, not everything you read is always 100% true. It's always good to have a healthy skepticism. Not that things are wrong, but sometimes you don't get the full picture. You're only getting like maybe 50 or 60%. Because like I said, there's always, another story to it. And it's important for you guys, to think about things and maybe, dig a little bit deeper. Don't always take everything, at the teacher's word, because I certainly don't know everything. Casey doesn't either. A lot of it's just what we were told, what we were taught. Okay. And, so it's basically coming from your professor's perspective. And in college or even in high school, if you only have one history teacher, it's kind of be from that perspective. That's why when you go to college, sometimes you have multiple professors, you hear different points of view, and you can always, do some research on your own and, dig a little bit deeper on your own. I think that's really important in history. All right, you guys, thanks for coming in. I will go ahead and post all these. Have a wonderful 4th of July, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.